I'm Andrew Maton from Zombie Off-Road, and this is my Toyota V8 powered Defender 130. If you've been following the channel, you would have noticed Pugly, the 130 Defender, featuring quite a few episodes. This was basically the successor to the Suzuki Samurai that I owned. The Samurai is a weapon and a trail rig of note. But the problem is, it's just too small for our camping and overlanding trips. This is where Pugly comes in. So I purchased the Defender in Joburg about 3.5 years ago. Drove it back down to Cape Town, its very first trip. And ever since working on it, loving it, enjoying the vehicle, it is pretty much an awesome rig for what it is. Trail rig, weekend warrior, and also a work truck basically. So after all the Samurai adventures, moving over to a Disco 1 in a Cedarburg Tankwa video which we did, I required a bit more space from the vehicle itself, especially when friends are in the vehicle as well. You need to pack the fridge in as well as all the camping equipment without going with the roof rack and everything on top. So my requirements were pretty simple. I wanted a solid axle vehicle with relatively low maintenance, quite a capable off-road vehicle, and preferably coil springs all round. Now the problem comes with there aren't many choices in buckies, utes or trucks, whatever you call them, that have coil springs front and rear. Biggest problem with that is usually coil springs can't carry that much weight as a leaf spring can, and it's also quite a more expensive and a heavier setup. I wanted a capable off-road rig, and that's kind of where the Defender fitted my description. First of all, it just looks like an adventure mobile, and then second, it's solid axles front and back. It's got coil springs front and back, and quite a flexible suspension as well. Easy to work on, and parts are also relatively cheap and accessible. Now this one is pretty special. This is obviously a Toyota V8 powered Defender 130. It's a Lexus 3UZ, which is a 4.3 litre V8, which is still relatively small in terms of V8 category. It is an aluminium block engine. It's got dual overhead cams, which makes it quite a fat engine for its size. It is, however, quite a reliable setup if looked after. And also I wanted an engine that made decent power without modifying it too much. As a Samurai, I learned quite a bit on reliability of engines. there's always something that needs tweaking on the motor to make it run safe and reliable. In this setup, I've got 180 to 200 kilowatts, depending on conditions and wherever, available on tap 24/7 pretty much, as long as you could keep it cool and feed it, basically. So that's the main reason why I got a V8 in this Defender. I've got nothing against the diesels, it's just at that time, the diesels were quite scarce, out of my price range, or a lot of kilometers on the clock, which I didn't trust. If you give me a petrol motor or a diesel motor, especially one with a lot of kilometers on it, I would usually tend to go towards the petrol motor. Maintenance is usually a lot cheaper, parts are cheaper as well. Obviously fuel is, they're going to use more fuel, but that kind of compensates for the maintenance costs on it. So far, this engine has had no major issues, usually just small things like a sensor that dodgy with dust or water ingress, and basically just maintenance stuff. So here's a list of quite a few pros I have on this vehicle itself. First of all, it's a petrol V8 motor. It's got relatively good power. It revs good. It loves to breathe. So this is quite a good vehicle for sand driving, especially spirited driving at all. It's relatively easy to work on this motor. It doesn't have too many electronics. It's got normal ECU sensors here and there. Parts are very inexpensive with these engines actually, and actually very available. If you look now in Gumtree, you'll find heaps of these motors, spares also. The biggest problem with these motors is people tend to neglect them because they are so cheap. So that's where the problem comes in with Lexus swaps or conversions. Now I know a lot of you would comment, this is a bastard setup and it's pretty crappy, a Lexus motor, which I kind of understand if you're coming from a background where the motor has been installed incorrectly. Your expectations was wrong on the motor, you installed it to save fuel. First of all, why do you install a V8 if you want to save fuel in it, right? You know it's going to be a V8, it's going to be petrol, it's going to be relatively powerful, and it's got decent torque. Now, all of those things are true. You have to look after the motor, obviously, like any other engine. So usually I would put in as close as possible to OEM type parts on the vehicle to keep the engine kind of happy running and focus on the rest of the car in terms of tweaking here and there, building this up. So far, this vehicle has been quite reliable. The only issues I've kind of had is kind of old car problems where seals go bust. Obviously, drivetrain take quite a bit of hit with this, with the big tires. I had 35s on, and things tend to wear out, obviously. Okay, now to discuss the cons on this vehicle. Obviously, it's thirsty on fuel. You've got a limited range. Fuel economy, you're talking about between 4.5 and 6 kilometers per liter, depending on driving style, what you load on it, how fast you drive, the whole lot. It's definitely better on fuel than my V8 Rover, which was 3.5 to 4.5 on a good day. Batch fire injection, so that was quite an old setup technology-wise as well, and the motor is quite old already. This is quite a fat motor to fit in there. It's physically bigger than an LS V8 in here. It's got dual overhead cams, 90-degree V8. So it's short, but it's very wide, especially for the Defender chassis. But it does fit with some work. Being a petrol motor, it doesn't have a lot of low-down torque, especially with this type of engine. Peak torque sits at 3,500 revs, so you need to know how to use your available power and torque to drive the situation. That's the thing, you can't compare it to a Chevy V8. You've got more than 20% capacity on the Chevys starting off with. So immediately you're comparing a pushrod motor with an overhead cam motor. Quite expensive to get here in South Africa. So this is actually quite a cheap bang for buck power plant. Another advantage on this setup is the Defender, quite easy to modify hands-on. It's basically a Meccano 4x4. There's a lot of aftermarket accessories available for these cars, and the parts are also quite cheap to get hold of. But now the other problem is you've also got your Defender maintenance, and usually it gets neglected. So you've got a vehicle that quite a lot of mileage on it, and also it needs to be looked after like any other vehicle. Now with this vehicle, I've already got 260,000 kilometers on the clock. So obviously it's not new, it's a 2000 model. So it's got a few years of wear and tear on it as well. In terms of comfort in a Defender, the V8 engine in this setup is surprisingly very comfortable to drive. It is very quiet actually. The only noise you hear is from the intake and the exhaust. It's got a medium noise level exhaust on it, which I prefer. It's not too loud and it's just loud enough so it sounds sporty when you stomp on it. Noise from the engine compared to my friend's TD5, I can honestly say this thing is a lot more quiet than that TD5. It's really a pleasure to drive on the road. Biggest noise is usually from the tires and wind noise around the corners. That brings me to another thing. The Defender is built like a brick. It's not aerodynamic at all. So fuel economy will not be good in this vehicle. Except if you go with a modern diesel engine, you're pretty much stuck at 5-6 kilometers a litre. Another pro and a con at the same time is actually the vehicle's construction, the bodywork. It's built out of aluminium, which is quite light. However, it does tend to get quite easily dented, and it is quite expensive to fix aluminium bodywork. The big problem with Defenders also, these things, they don't have a very strong roof structure. If this thing flips on its roof, the chances of the occupant surviving that accident, especially high speed, is very minimal, which is quite a big safety concern if you're considering that as well when buying a Defender. They are aftermarket kits, but it needs to be an external roll cage because the interior space for such a big vehicle, it's not very spacious at all. But at the end of the day, you go what you want. You can't get best of all. It is narrow on the tracks, definitely not as wide as the cruisers and patrols, so it's easier to navigate tracks. However, with this thing being a long wheelbase, it kind of cancels out because turns become quite a mission, and you start to exercise quite a bit on the steering wheel to get this thing through corners. Parking and town driving this vehicle, it's not very fun to drive, especially with the big wheels on it. So I would say if you could, the 90 Defender is probably a better town car. 110 is the perfect in between. And then the 130 is more a utility bakkie or overlanding platform to build on top. This thing is set up modular. I don't want to add a lot of weight on it, keep the vehicle agile. It's already quite a heavy vehicle, big chassis, strong points at the back. It can carry 1 ton legally, which is the heaviest in its class. So I've used this vehicle quite a lot for building materials and stuff around the house. And also it needs to be my weekend warrior and also long distance camping. In the future, when I start doing overlanding trips, I would definitely prefer a standard setup. If something does go wrong, easier to get parts hold of, and it's also a newer setup, which this is obviously a bit worn in, and sometimes requires specialist parts from areas. I have no idea how to diagnose the engine if it got stuck in the middle of nowhere, so I prefer to keep with something old school, which I know how to work on. By today's standards, it's ancient technology, something probably like a mechanical diesel engine. So, if you would ever own a four-wheel drive with an engine from a different make, let me know in the comments below which one you prefer, or if not, what's the reason for that. Thank you guys for watching on this episode. I'm Andrew Maton from Zombie Off-Road. Cheers. Check you guys next time.